I think we are in our sixth program of the introduction by H.Loewe in a Rabbinic Anthology, selected with an introduction by C.G. Montefiore and H.Loewe. What is said on page XXVII about conscious accommodation is very largely true, in my opinion. We must remember that many rabbis, in spite of their learning, were simple folk. It was with simple folk that they had to deal. Anthropomorphisms were unavoidable, but they were often mitigated by such caveats as kabeakol, if it be proper to say so, page 587. To generalize is difficult. There were many differences of type, individuality, and circumstance. I would say that the combination of ceremonial and moral, which is the aim of halakha, tends to raise the former, not to cheapen the latter. See number 273 and 322 and 323. This theme is too detailed and too controversial to be discussed at length. It is the ceremonial element that is protective. It prevents the disappearance of Judaism in its environment. 307 to 308. When David Rahabah came to India and found some people whom he rightly thought to be Jews, though they were scarcely distinguishable from their Indian environment, it was not the Shema which proved that they belonged to the house of Israel, but the fact that they eschewed fish, lacking scales and fins. For the discipline of the Torah, see page XXXI, is so powerful a shield that it could be laid aside only at grave risk. It may not matter to God whether we eat or avoid pig. To us it does matter, just as it matters to us whether we clean our teeth or not. The old Gaib at the Breslau school, think what you like, but carry out the commands, has always seemed to me most unjust. Well, it's more of a sacrifice if you're finding it mentally or otherwise difficult, right? It really means a combination of progress and tradition. It allows intellectual development and freedom of thought, while it safeguards the Jewish life and strengthens the brotherhood of Israel. In any disciplined life, there are regulations which seem to outsiders to be superfluous and ludicrous. Foreigners make fun of Oxford and Cambridge for granting degrees by permutation. We make fun of American universities for granting degrees by credits, a test which we choose to consider mechanical. Both systems work. In neither case is the facile Gaib justified. In each case, it may easily be justified. As has been said before, institutions can be regarded from two aspects. There is always scope for criticism, genuine or specious, just as there is always an element of value. For the question of ridicule of the commandments by Gentiles, see 400 and 407, as Mr. Montefiore says, the view that the mitzvot are God's arbitrary decrees tended to destroy the superstition, 410 and 527, that there was a possibility of danger from a mechanical legalism is not to be denied, 553, but I do not think that it was very real. A system of discipline makes the danger inevitable when operative among simple folks. There is also the danger of a wrongful use of zakut and of tit for tat. See 583, 601, and 632. I have said a word on this matter already. Selection 1641. And finally, with regard to Mr. Montefiore's Bet Noir of Tit for Tat, page XXXV, which defaces the Orthodox liturgy, Seb 11.6, per book, page 121, I find that since I wrote my note about women, my remarks receive support from Poole's new prayer book, which on page 134 renders the passage thus: It was held that women may die in childbirth for the following 3 transgressions. Karma doesn't work like that, because bad things don't always happen to people because they did something bad. This seems to me perfectly adequate. Nobody has ever been known to take the remark literally. As an old superstition in a piece of historical reading, it is not uninteresting, and it does not really belong to the service at all, though it is included in the prayer book, but so are many other passages, such as the Ethics of the Fathers, the Royal Crown, Psalm 119, and many other psalms. Perek, Shirah, Songs of Nature, praising God, the Amadot, etc., all of which will be found in different prayer books, according to the editor's choice. These are meant for private study or devotion. In the same way, many liturgies have extracts of halakha for reading before or after service. The Bet Noir, however, appears to have invaded the service proper. Really, according to the Sephardic rite, it intervened between afternoon and evening service and was intended for private study. At this period, the reference to the Sabbath lamp was peculiarly appropriate. According to the Ashkenazic rite, it intervened between evening service and Kiddush and was also intended for the individual if he desired to read it, but the evening service has overflowed its limits in both directions and has caught up the offending chapter much as London has absorbed the outlying suburbs, and so the passage is now actually read in many Orthodox synagogues. It is, however, omitted in many, but the most orthodox of all rites, that of Isaac Luria, the Kabbalist Nusach Ari, lacks the passage in synagogue and in liturgy altogether. For example, see Siddur or Olam, Wilna, 1909. The Yemenites, I believe, also lack the passage, since it is unusual among them not to read a set piece, but to have a text read through, chapter by chapter. So, Mr. Montefiore must join the Luria group, since there is not, to my knowledge, a Yemenite synagogue in London. But there is one important factor which I have reserved to the end. Superstitions are often employed as means of inculcating morals. Not to spill the salt teaches economy and so on. People are, unfortunately, more prone to fear a supposed bad luck than a real blemish. This particular superstition was intended as an old wives' adage, preaching chastity and self-control. It was appropriate to Friday night, which was regarded as the proper time for husband and wife to meet in love. I cannot feel as indignant as Mr. Montefiore is about this point. 5 women, to what Mr. Montefiore says on page XVII, I have to some extent at least replied on page 656. I revert to the question because Mr. Morris, in his book The Jewish School, to which I have referred in note 4, discusses it. Woman and Her Education, page 24. Mr. Morris takes rather a gloomy view, in my opinion. His array of facts is accurate and well chosen, but I cannot help feeling that some of his conclusions are overstatements. I doubt whether the position of women was generally so unenviable as he would suggest. For example, too much stress must not be laid on phraseology and collocation. Thus, the collocation of women and fields does not prove that in practice women were always regarded as chattels. An obvious parallel suggests itself. The Church of England marriage service applies to the wife. Habendum clause, customary to the taking possession of property. To have and to hold, are ketubah, contains analogous legal terms, but neither in church nor in synagogue is woman regarded as a chattel today. So in that way they're liberal because they've stepped away from, the basic values that their elders decided were religious. Mr. Morris ends his suggestive chapter with the following sound conclusion. In the writings of the rabbis, we find something of both these moods, i.e. of appreciation and depreciation, but a characteristic sense of reality helped them to escape from either extreme. 6. The spatial conception of God's dwelling, see page XXVI and numbers 48, 158, and 25. What Mr. Montefiore says is, it seems to me very fair, but I do not think that the rabbis troubled about metaphysical questions. God was the great unknown, the unknowable save by metaphor. I very much doubt whether they pursued the subject far enough to inquire into the literal applicability of the metaphors. The Pharisees objected strongly to the localizing of the divine presence. Hence, they prohibited the Sadducean procedure of kindling the incense outside the veil, an act which was based on the theory that God was, in some special sense, more present within the veil than without. See Judaism and Christianity, Volume 1, page 135. Again, the Targumim are permitted by a strong antipathy to anthropomorphism, which is but another aspect of a spatial deity. 7. Works and faith. 35, XXXV, weird, XCVII. The rabbinic antithesis is not between faith and works, but between learning and works. The apostles were missionaries who had to bring the Gentiles to faith. Of the rabbinic missionary epistles or arguments, we have little, if any, knowledge, though we know of their missionary activity. It is an accident that nothing rabbinic outside of Palestine has survived. For in this sense, Philo is hardly representative of rabbinic thought. Now, the rabbis in Palestine worked among people who already had faith, but who lacked learning. Hence, the difference in the two sets of alternatives. 8. There are no such religious geniuses and innovators as Jesus, Paul, and the author of the fourth gospel among the rabbis, page XX. Well, the fourth gospel, John, was a rewrite of something about Bacchus from 4 centuries earlier, and some of the church fathers admit this, and we found evidence of this. The so-called Lord's Prayer was an old Jewish prayer that predates them calling it Judaism by name, but certainly we can probably postulate from 540 BCE onwards there was something that we could call Judaism. in a historical sense. I wonder if we count heads, then these three persons undoubtedly influenced more people than did the rabbis. I should be inclined to say that, in this manner of reckoning, Socrates had a still greater influence than these three, since they influenced Christians, whereas the influence of Socrates was and is acknowledged not only by Christians, but also by many more people. But if we take the religious genius to refer to his own faith, to his own place, and to the extent and abiding value of his work, then surely we may cite rabbis like Yohanan ben Zakkai or Judah the Prince. There is, however, another consideration to be borne in mind. Burkitt used to say Judaism is a religion of ideals, Christianity of an ideal person. I have drawn attention to this significance elsewhere, but it cannot be emphasized too often. Judaism stresses the message but neglects the messenger. Hence, we have so few biographies of great men. How many do we know? Gluckel von Hameln, Gluckel von Hameln, Septhai Zebi, Bear of Bolochow, Hayim, David Azoulay, etc. A rather meager lot in truth. There is no article, biography, or autobiography in the Jewish Encyclopedia. It is against the Jewish genius. That is why there is no gospel according to John Zacchaeus, alias Yohanan ben Zakkai. I have always said that his disciples could have written one had they wished to do so. I have often said that it could be done today in view of the material available, and now such a work has been undertaken. Dr. Finkelstein's Akaba is a splendid example for others to follow. After reading it, one can hardly deny to Akaba the title of a religious genius or innovator. This may be conceded, but still the extent of the influence may be denied. This denial is, I believe, due to a misconception of the far-reaching influence of the work of rabbis as religious innovators. Jews and Christians alike take it for granted because it was effective before Judaism and Christianity parted. Two examples will make this clear. They may be taken from the social rather than from the purely ethical sphere. Think how Hillel's prospal has affected Christian and Jewish society. But for this, Jesus could not have uttered the parable of the talents. Neither Christians nor Jews could engage in commerce, and the ecclesiastical commissioners could not hold a single share that paid a dividend. Was not the prospal a religious innovation as far-reaching as the abolition of the dietary laws? Again, take the case of Simon B. I don't know if it's Ben or Bar, but Shettach. He made the ketubah a safeguard for the rights of married women and a check to hasty divorce. Does not the introduction of this covenant mark an important stage in the progress of female emancipation? Dr. Rabinowitz rightly draws attention to the importance of Simon's action. Its importance is not generally recognized. People think of Simon in connection with his sentencing women to death at Ascalon, but they overlook this great innovation of which the credit is his. Here again we see that the Halakha proves a valuable source for estimating advance in social ethics. These instances are selected at haphazard. Very few Jews and still less Christians realize what a debt society owes to these religious innovators. 9. Zakut, page XXXVI. No doubt this idea arose from the ancient conception of corporate solidarity. The individual was merged in his unit for better or for worse, and the doctrine of personal responsibility grew up and saved the innocent individual from being involved in the punishment of his guilty kinsman. Fathers were not to be put to death for children. The sons of Korah died not, for an example of the development of this idea. 1093. It may well be that the doctrine of tit for tat, which Mr. Montefiore dislikes so greatly, was the first mitigation of the older belief that a man and his household were one and indivisible. Personal responsibility disposed of the belief that sin was a force that could spread far and wide and entrap helpless man, as Orestes was entrapped. That is possibly one explanation of the mysterious proverb in Deuteronomy 29:19, which may be translated, "Lest the wet sweep away the dry," i.e., that rain be not a boon to the parched ground, but a destruction. So much for the side of evil. On the other, it was sometimes held that good was indestructible. Probably before the idea of immortality grew up, this heritage of good applied to this life, that your days and those of your children belong in the land. Hence arose later the idea of a storehouse of grace. The widow of a VC may wear his medal. So, the merit of an ancestor avails his descendants. Well, they may reference it, but the widow and other family could be the support and what enabled individuals to get stuff like that done. So it's not quite the same thing. To some extent, this may be explained as training and heredity. A careful upbringing may transmit paternal values, whether acquired characteristics are transmissible is a theme of controversy to biologists. The idea of zakut received support from the doctrine of the suffering servant. When that doctrine was given a Christological interpretation in the church, the reaction in the synagogue was strange. It made the doctrine of zakut far stronger than before, but it transferred it to the patriarchs and heroes. A good example is furnished by the theme of the Akada, the binding of Isaac. The original lesson which the story of Genesis XXII conveyed was that human sacrifices were detested by God. And there were cultures that had them. When the era of human sacrifices had long passed, well, now it's done for the state rather than some cult officially, but the story lost much of its topical interest. It became a piece of antiquarianism. The stress laid in the church on the agnostia motive, however, made Jews look for a parallel. Under the influence of the adage, Mech Shabbat ke Ma'asa, the will for the deed, Abraham's obedience and Isaac's submission became cardinal points. It was as though the sacrifice had actually been consummated. Therefore, the readiness of Abraham and Isaac to follow the divine command at all cost was elevated to a liturgical theme, as it still remains. The poems in the liturgy on the Akada and the appeals to the merit of the patriarchs are in fact regarded as prayers to God to make us worthy of our ancestors and capable of following their example. This conception would, I fancy, not be absent from the liberal liturgy, and so I would like to qualify Mr. Montefiore's remark that it seems to have wholly passed away from modern Judaism, whether Orthodox or liberal. I fancy it would be more accurate to say that it has survived in a much modified form as regards Isaiah 53, see selection 1529. I don't know how many programs later that's going to be. For the idea of Zakut in Christianity, see page XXXII. 10 hyperbole, see 1093, and page LXXXIV, we are in CI. As Mr. Montefiore says, must not be taken literally. We must compare the use of paradox in the Gospels. A rabbi would exaggerate one aspect of a case in order to drive home his moral, quite oblivious of the fact that on the previous day he had stressed the other side. He might on Monday be teaching the lesson of God's omnipotent mercy and say that it could prevail over all. On Tuesday, when emphasizing the evils of perjury, he might declare that it was the unforgivable sin. As we have so often said, the rabbis were not philosophers. See what Mr. Montefiore writes on page XLV. Well, weren't they philosophers? Just not both in the popular sense and otherwise. 11, the name of God. 9, 17, 158, etc. I venture to differ from Mr. Montefiore in regard to the use of the divine name in English. I reject naturally the erroneous form, wrongly said to be the invention of Petrus Galatinus in 1518 of the Common Era, but occurring in the manuscripts of the 14th century, and I prefer to follow the American Jewish version in Exodus 17:15, which has Adonai Nissi. The incorrect form of the EV is used in 158, but I object also to the use of the conventional modern form as given in 9 for 3 reasons. A, I agree with Canon Lukin Williams that the form is more probably Yahoo. Therefore, I do not, as a student, wish to use a wrong form. See 1 Journal of Theological Studies, XXVIII. We can just say the number, but 28, April 1927, page 276 to 283. 2 Burkitt's Note, same source, July 1927, page 407 to 409. 3, the Tetragrammaton, name or surrogate, Leitschrift, FDAT, was 1936, page 262 to 269. And 4, the Lord of Hosts, Journal of Theological Studies, 38, January 1937, page 50 to 56. B, but if A is correct, then as a human being I must avoid it. If I were to address an early monarch, even one whose moral character commanded no respect, I should be obliged to employ a paraphrases, an abstract noun, out of common decency. In the case of the deity, then a fortiori, or as the rabbis would say, al-achat, kama, ve kama. See, finally, as a Jew, I take exception to the form, since it is very often used to depreciate the Jewish conception of God and to create an artificial and unreal antithesis between a so-called Christian conception of God, maker of heaven and earth, alleged to be unknown to Israel, although it is to be found in Genesis 14:19, a chapter considered to be adapted from a cuneiform source. Now, look at the tablets of Ebla and Elam in particular. For some of the books mentioned in the Bible are actually bigger than the Bible. There's 74 texts that are referred to that are not canon. From some analysts' account, and a so-called Jewish tribal particularist God with a small g, devoid of ethical attributes. There is no denying the fact that this sentiment is to be found in many a textbook of Old Testament history. Because they consider it Old Testament. That's part of the issue too. Because Jesus would not have called it that, according to what the Bible has Jesus say. I've heard it expounded in lecture rooms, and I have raged and rebelled against its inherent falseness. But the converse tendency is equally to be shunned. The progress of revelation is an established fact. We would not go back to the miraculous conception of the birth of Juno, fully armed. The middle course is the best. I think it is safer to adopt a non-committal policy and retain the old-fashioned equivalence of the divine name. With regard to the name of God, I take this very strong line which I have outlined. Well, let us remember that command wasn't just a tetragrammaton formula. It was really about every formula that we would consider a name in our modern English, that you don't use it secularly. On other points, I consider that concessions to convenience and conventional usage are justifiable. For example, I always avoid the terms Old Testament and Anno Domini when speaking to a purely Jewish audience or when writing for Jews only. In such cases, the terms would be unreal and unsuitable. But when I am writing for general readers, I have no objection to referring to the Old Testament or giving the date as AD. One can carry scrupulousness to undue extremes. Now, you can use CE and BCE and BP and other things that don't imply that. And of course, if you use the Hebrew date, then, even Jews may not know what year it is unless you point out that this is this month and this year, and, particularly when you only use numbers. 12, on page XXVII, Mr. Montefiore speaks of our reserve in speaking of God. And he wonders whether the rabbinic attitude is over-familiar. I would refer to my previous remarks on page CIIB, also to page LXXVI footnote and selection 350 later on. Here we have an interesting example of the conflict between reserve and familiarity. The holiness of the divine name demands reserve, but reserve may make for remoteness from God. To reinforce the religious spirit, it was proposed to introduce the pronunciation of the name, but this led to familiarity, and the proposal was soon abortive. 13, page XXXI, what Mr. Montefiore says about abstaining from lobsters and the method of killing animals is capable of being put in another way. I have defined revelation as that factor which causes certain customs to survive for a moral purpose, which may or may not be clear to any particular generation at a given stage in time. Page LXXII, the survival of the dietary laws seems, to me at least, to indicate that they have a purpose. It is no less intellectual to obey them than it is to remain attached to other ancient symbols. Example of royalty or law, see my remarks on page 356. We are in CIII. Why should a Jew be silly if he eschews pork, when it is not considered silly? In fact, it is laudable for a Scot to eat haggis. And during the time of Antiochus IV, or again under the Inquisition, many a Jew went to his death rather than eat pork and pass as a renegade. The enormous momentum which the dietary laws have thus gathered cannot be overlooked. They have become an epitome of fidelity to Judaism. That is why they survived. The rabbis knew quite well as any scientist or philosopher that it does not matter to God what we eat and what we avoid. See selections 403 to 404, but it will matter to us. Well, in a way, you can say it's not about what you do or don't do, it's about what you're doing it for or not doing it for. But if the commandment's the outer commandment's the outer commandment, right? Are Jews any better than we are because they eat pork? Are Christians any better than we are because they eat pork? Well, the Christians are disobeying Jesus. Jesus doesn't say that you change the law. And even the dream of, was it Peter or Paul? The interpretation wasn't that you can eat the unlawful. It was that, this conception of, hear these people, that you can't spread the word to them, but you can. Are we any better than they because we do not? I am no advocate of what is called pot and pan theism, but I see that these laws have survived for good reason, and because they have survived, they are divinely approved for Jews. And as to slaughter of animals, so long as the horrors I have mentioned on page XCII continue, the Jewish method of humane slaughter needs no defense. And, the stunning and the drugging, as shown around this time in the 30s, was far more cruel, even though the animals weren't fighting. It may have looked a little bit nicer sometimes, but it was quite cruel, a way to kill animals. And the drugging, of course, affected the meat for the person to consume even more than stunning did. 14, page XXXV, footnote 2, Mr. Montefiore thinks it inconceivable that learned men should utter absurdities. Absurdities is a relative term. He expects too much. Some of the extracts which Mr. Snape cites seem equally absurd if we judge by modern standards. Yet the church fathers were learned men and had an advantage in this respect over the rabbis, in that they, or some of them, had contact with Greek philosophy. The point that matters, it seems to me, is that these absurdities left no mark in either case. Sometimes they had their use. For example, the use of numerical arrangements for convenience and for mnemonics. See page XCIV. 15, see page LXVII. With regard to the halakhic authority of prophets and hagiographa called Kabbalah, see 428. On the one hand, RH7A maintains that Zechariah and Esther have Pentateuchal authority. On the other, Chag 10b will not permit the Pentateuch to be interpreted by Amos. Gen R VII, I think it's just 7, number 2, or is that the symbol for verse? The page 51, 52, similarly rejects Nehemiah, T.J. Chall, 1, Section 1, Folio 57b, line 16, refuses to allow halakha to be deduced from Isaiah 28:25. Isaiah is called Kabbalah in Sefer Num Shalach, section 112, folio 33a, HP 120, 16, page XVI. The Turgid and Turbid Mass offers a striking contrast to the orderliness of the New Testament documents. Rabbinic literature was not edited, and in contrast to patristics, no book was the planned creation of one author. The stylistic inelegance is therefore an argument for trustworthiness. There are just a few things that I would like to add to Mr. Montefiore's preface before I lay down the pen finally and bid the printers release the press, which has been waiting so patiently to be quit of the authors. These things are not intended to complete deficiencies in my introduction, conscious as I fully am of its many shortcomings and of its unfitness to follow that of my colleague. For that, the time is gone by quod scripsi, but the moment of bidding farewell to this book is indeed a solemn one. It marks the conclusion of a delightful quest of many hours spent in intimate contact with the rabbis of old, of numerous attempts spent in intimate contact, of numerous attempts to understand them, to unravel their obscurities, and to estimate their worth, and above all, of daily lectures from and frequent visits to one whom I am proud and grateful to call, in David's words, my master, my guide, and my intimate friend. If I have in any small degree contributed something to these pages, it is insignificant as a drop from a bucket compared with what he has given. The last sentence of his preface is therefore just fantastic. No other term will do. Over this, he and I differ far more than over any rabbinic controversy, including even his Bete Norir, which, with my attempts at whitewashing, the reader has discovered by now. And it is not simply to Mr. Montefiore's critical insight and sense of values that the book owes, and I too owe so much. His admirable grasp of rabbinic thought, his facility in handling text, his familiarity with rabbinic idiom and language have taught me more than I can put into words. Before I spoke of deficiencies in my introduction, alas, there are loose ends, not a few. There and elsewhere Mr. Montefiore has been very seriously ill, and I have been incapacitated less seriously. But none the less, my movements have been gravely hampered precisely at the time when he and I would normally have been putting the finishing touches to our work, eliminating unintentional doublets, filling gaps, and checking references for the last time. As I write these lines, the hour of danger has passed, and the joy that the thought of Mr. Montefiore's recovery brings makes the fear of blemishes less awesome than perhaps it should be. I must mention, too, our deep sense of gratitude to three friends who have stepped into the breach so nobly and given us such precious help. I named these in alphabetical sequence, for we would not differentiate the various forms of aid so generously offered us. The Rev. H. St. John Hart, chaplain and fellow of Queen's College, Mr. W.C. Piggott of the University Press, Dr. L. Rabinowitz, rabbi of the Cricklewood Synagogue. To these three friends, our sense of obligation is very real. The Cambridge University Press, too, deserves our warmest thanks for constant help. This book has presented problems of its own, but no trouble has been too great for the printers. Mr. Lewis has been amazingly patient in difficulties which have been frequent. He has never failed to find a way out. Our wishes, often unreasonable, I fear, have had his sympathetic consideration, and his staff have given us of their best. The Hebrew term by which printing was originally known is the holy work, a phrase applied in Exodus to the construction of the sacred tabernacle. To diffuse knowledge is to build a sanctuary. Till quite recent times, the compositors and correctors of a Hebrew book printed their names, towns, and dates at the end as a colophon. We fain would follow this excellent tradition, and so we thank our unknown friends and fellow workers whose anonymity the etiquette of modern typography imposes. This night is doubly appropriate for the conclusion of this book. It is a book about the Torah, and today has been the anniversary of giving of the Torah. Pentecost is just over. As I write, the date is still the 6th of June, according to the prevailing Gregorian calendar. By Hebrew reckoning, it is already 8 Siwan, but 6th June is Mr. Montefiore's birthday. And now, as I lay down the pen, I am conscious of the time-honored custom that when the Pentateuchal cycle is ended, it begins instantly anew. The Aztec and Mayan calendar ending of cycles, people thought that was the end, and it's like they never said that that was the last cycle, 1999 or 2012 or or whatever they're going to find that they're going to reference like that too. So things starting instantly anew is pretty standard if it's in mythology. No sooner has Deuteronomy 34 been read than a new scroll is opened. Genesis 1. If a man begins a good work, they say to him, carry on. As we say goodbye to this anthology, I would reveal a secret. 2 years ago, Mr. Montefiore gave me a copy of Mrs. M.W. Tileston's Great Soul's Prayer, and lamented that there was no Jewish parallel. I told him then, and I have remembered this daily, that he could provide one, since his preface is dated on his 80th birthday, and since 80 years are for strength is the rabbinic version of Psalm 90 verse 10. May we express the hope that renewed health and strength will bring yet another addition to the BM catalog, SVCGM. Herbert Lowe. The night of 6th of June, 1938, 8 Siwan, 5698. And of the systems of transcription, we have an apostrophe for the smooth breathing, usually emitted when the initial aleph. We can think of it as person with their arms and legs open, but that's actually closer to what the H is from. The ayin is the backwards apostrophe. They say rough breathing, but would be closer. The H with the dot is the chet, so cha. The K with the dot is the off. The T with the dot is the tha. Got to remember that one. The S, the plain S is the sheen with the dot on the left side. It's that 3-branch thingamajigger. The dot below is usually what would be used for the semek, but not here, so you can't really distinguish how it's transliterated. And the dot over the sheen on the right side is just listed as the sh. And the z with the dot, the tzade, the tz would make it clearer, right? The absence of the weak dagesh is not indicated by the plain H, thus wubkol equals ubekul, ubekol, not ubekol, nor is sheva, whether simple or compound written over the line asher, not asher. Dagesh forte after the article is omitted. Ha-din, not had-din. The P is sometimes F and sometimes the PH. The B is sometimes B and sometimes V. You know, because they're using it alphabetical now. And the biblical reference are to the authorized version, the Hebrew text, MT, Masoretic text. Certain common conventional spellings have been retained, both, not abed, akaba, not akeba, getzer, hara, not getzer, hara, ha-aretz, not har-aretz, derek, eretz, etc. The same applies to abbreviations. Abzar for abzar. Certain individual inconsistencies will be observed. The lesson from the Pentateuch is from Penachos, and there'll be some other explanations. Now, the abbreviations are going to be a lot more useful. MEK, Makilta, PB, per book, Singer's per book in particular, PESK, Pesikta, Kahana, PSR, Pesikta, Rabata, R, Rabba. For example, Gen R equals Genesis, Rabba. Tanch, Tanchuma, Tanchba, Tanhuma, edited by S. Buber. And there are yet more considerations. I should probably bookmark this because I may turn back. Zeb, Z-E-B, Zebachim, Yeb, Y-E-B, Yebamot, Yabmut, T-E-R, terror, Terumot, T-E-M, Tem, Temara, T-A-M, Tamid, T-A, backwards apostrophe, A-N, Ta'anit, S-U-K, Sukkah, S-O-T dot below, so Sotha, S-H-E-K, Shek, Shekalim, S-A-N, Sun, Sanhedrin, S-A-B, Sabbath, Shabbath, R-H, Rosh Hashanah, P-E-S, Pes, Achim, N-I-D, Nid, Nida, N-E-D, Nidarim, M-K, Moed, Pathon, M-E-N, Menachot, MEG, Megillah, MAK, Makat, K with the dot, ID, Kedushin, KET, Ketubot, KER, Keratot, H with the dot, UL, Chulin, sometimes it's Chulin, I'm not sure sometimes if the I could be the plural. If the N's a plural, then it's definitely in. HOR, Horiot, H with the dot, HAL, Chala, H with the dot, HG, Chagiga, GIT, but with the dot, Githin, backwards apostrophe, ERUB, Arubin, DER, ERZ, Derek, Eretz, Zutha, DEM, Dama'eh, BIK, Bikurim, BEZ with the dot, Betza, BER, Better Coat, Bab M, Baba, Metzia, Bab K, Baba, oh, it's with the dot, Baba Kama, Bab B, Baba Batra, Arakin, Abzar, Abodah, Zerah, Abrn, Aboth de Rebbe, Nathan, and well, after this program, we're going to get into our main text, but looks like we're going to have some chapters, as they're called. So these chapters are going to be the nature and character of God, God's love for Israel, man's nature and God's grace, Israel's love for God, the law, study and practice of goodness. 7 is the commandments, the Sabbath, and the law. 8, reward, merit, and atonement. 9, divine mercy and divine judgment, idolatry and martyrdom. 10, the importance of motive, our intention, kawana, and lishma, the love, the fear, and the praise of God. 11, the doctrine of evil inclination, righteousness, and sin. 12, man's repentance and God's compassion. 13, hope and faith, miracles. 14, on prayer. 15, justice, honesty, truth, and oaths. 16, on charity. 17, on industry and independence, on poverty and riches. 18, hospitality, courtesy, and good manners. 19, piety, forgiveness, and love. 20, on humility and pride. 21, various ethical conceptions. 22, family, A, father and mother. 23, the family, B, the wife. 14, the family, C, children. 15, asceticism. 26, peace. 27, this life in comparison with the next life. 28, on sufferings. 29, the Gentiles. 30, on proselytes. 31, the life to come, resurrection and judgment. And then we have excursus 1, the use of the adjectives Jewish and Christian in England, C.G. Montefiore. Excursus 2, rabbinical and early Christian ethics, R.H. Snape. Notes, H.Loewe. Excursus 3, the rabbis and their generations and their countries, H.Loewe. List of rabbis. Excursus 4, the dating of rabbinical material, H.Loewe. Table of dates of extracts, glossary, list of editions used, list of biblical passages, list of Greek and Latin passages, list of rabbinic passages, and a general index. And might as well. Well, I don't know if the back is particular to the print, so I'm going to not read the back.